Welcome to the Happy Doc. My name is Taylor Brana, a fourth-year medical student and your host. This show is inspired by a simple idea. I think we all have the human capability of being happy in any field of work we are passionate about. Specifically in the world of medicine, there's a growing idea that medicine isn't what it used to be, that there is less and less joy in the practice of this beautiful field whose goal is to help others. As a medical student, I refuse to believe my future as a doctor is mediocre at best. With this mindset, I have launched the Happy Doc, an audio series where I will interview current happy practicing physicians to find out their journey, their tips and tricks, their mindset, and much more to find out what has allowed them to succeed in such a demanding field. Please get your weekly dose of the Happy Doc and gain insight, tools, and strategies to cultivate your inner happiness.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Draper. I am board certified in family medicine, but I'm currently pursuing certification in functional medicine, and I've got a wellness and fitness practice in Memphis, Tennessee.
Awesome. So it's great to have you on this podcast today. And just something you touched on. So you said you practice in functional medicine. Can you explain that to the listeners?
Sure. So functional medicine is basically seeking to address the root causes, not just the symptoms. Now, of course, sometimes we have to address the symptoms, and that's important. But what I became increasingly frustrated with after I got out into practice was handing out a bunch of drugs, handing out a bunch of prescriptions, and really not addressing the root causes of the patient's complaints, which were often lifestyle related. So with our practice model, we're looking at incorporating nutrition and fitness and all the other components in addition to some of the medication and supplementation things that we address specifically so that we can not only have the patient feel better but try to build health as opposed to just treat illness.
Wow, that's awesome, and definitely something that is very needed. So if there were a student that was interested in looking further into something like functional medicine, how would you propose they would do that?
Yeah, so from a student standpoint, I think it's important once you actually get your feet wet and get some experience in medicine to find out why it was that you went into medicine in the first place. I think most of us really wanted to help patients and wanted to make a meaningful difference, and that's just something that you can't do if you only have 5 minutes of FaceTime with the patient. So looking at what talents you bring to the table as a physician, what interests you have in medicine, what you're really passionate about. When you're able to align all of those, you really don't have to work a day in your life. And I heard people say that, and I never really believed it because I had never been at that point. But now that I'm there, it's pretty amazing.
That's great. It's good to hear someone who truly feels that way. So what is your typical day like, and why does that feel so ideal to you?
My typical day, I typically will start seeing patients at 11. I'll schedule patients on the hour. I'll see 3 patients in the morning, and I'll see another 3 patients in the afternoon. And if I have to, I can work in a 7th patient. My average patient visit is 45 minutes, so I have plenty of time to make sure that we're addressing all of the different issues. Oftentimes, the patients that I work with have already seen multiple other physicians and have not been satisfied or haven't been able to receive the answers that they've needed. So in some ways it's challenging, but it's also really rewarding at the same time.
That's great. And so you said you started at 11 o'clock every day?
Did I say 11? I meant 9. Sorry.
Oh, 9 o'clock. Okay. And you work 5 days a week, and you see 6 to 7 patients?
I work 4 days a week, and then on Fridays I work for the university, teaching med students and residents, and then I'll also take call Friday night, covering labor and delivery in the hospital. So that's a 24-hour shift on Fridays.
Okay, great. And that seems something that you're passionate about, so you've worked that into your schedule.
Yep. And it's nice because it really helps me appreciate what I do Monday through Thursday, having that reality check on Fridays. So Friday mornings, I'm in the typical clinic setting where patients are scheduled every 15 minutes, and I get to be on the assembly line medicine. Although in a lot of ways we've been able to even change the culture of the typical residency training program. What we've done now is I've requested to have a team work with me. So I have one resident and one medical student. So between the three of us, over a 3 to 4 hour period, we're able to see 11 patients, which is nice.
Wow. So that's great that you've been able to tie in kind of your more avant-garde approach, so to speak, even within the typical clinical setting.
Well, I think what has happened is it's really become apparent to the other physicians with whom I work at the residency program, as well as the patients, that there really is a demand for this higher level of care medicine, that patients don't want to wait an hour for a 5-minute visit and don't want to have their concerns dismissed just because there's not enough time to address it. So being able to approach things a little bit different is valuable, not only from a training standpoint, but also from a professional standpoint, in that if somebody is going to go rogue and get out of the insurance business and have a cash pay practice, you have to offer something that patients are willing to pay for that they can't get with their copay using their traditional insurance.
Right, exactly. So the quality has to be elevated, and it seems like you've been able to do that. Just to take a step back, where are you located currently?
So currently our practice is in Memphis, Tennessee. We also have a second location in Jackson, Tennessee that my nurse practitioner runs.
Okay, great. And can you explain the transition from the typical, you described it as assembly line medicine, to what you have now?
Sure. So right out of residency, I joined a great clinic. It was, your classic traditional primary care clinic. There were two senior physicians that had been there for a while. It really was a great clinic. The challenge was we had a lot of overhead. So for 3 physicians, there were 24 employees there. We had to see a high volume in order to support that, and I knew that no matter how hard I tried, I was never going to be comfortable seeing 25 to 30 patients a day, and I wasn't going to be okay doing that for the next 25 years of my life. So it wasn't a few months into that I was trying to figure out, how do I get out of my contract? What am I going to do? Do I even want to be a doctor at this point, or am I going to find something else so I'm not miserable?
Right. And then, so how did you kind of transition? Where was your breaking point, and what did you work on in order to develop yourself from there?
Sure. So I think I realized that at that point, that early on in my career, and this was in 2012, that the riskiest thing was trying to play it safe. So it was just me. I didn't have a family or kids to support, so I was able to take some of those risks. So I consciously made the effort to still live like a resident while I was actually making real doctor money, and anything extra that I wasn't used to anyways, I put aside, and that was my startup money for our clinic. And we took a real basic model. I didn't need a lot of fancy equipment. I just needed some, office furniture and some basic medical equipment and a place to sit and interact with my patients. Now, the first 2 years, we tried to do the traditional insurance model, and that failed miserably. And
Okay.
I'm glad that we tried it, because I can honestly tell patients that I did all I could to make it work, but single-handedly, I wasn't able to fix a broken system. So rather than trying to fix something broken, we had to start over and try to create something better, and that's what we did.
Mm-hmm. So what? So let's talk about the insurance for a second first, actually. Um, what were the difficulties with trying to utilize the insurance system as opposed to just doing direct pay?
Sure. So with the insurance system, I guess I thought, I'm a doctor, I'm smart enough, I should be able to figure out how to bill and code. That's, no big deal, right? And then I realized that it's one of the most counterintuitive, convoluted systems out there. It does not make any logical sense. The hoops that you have to jump through aren't worth your time. And I just realized that, unless I was willing to hire a staff to handle all of this for me, that there was going to be no way I could do that. And then if I hired the staff, I had to see the volume to support their salaries, and I was back in the same situation I was trying to avoid in the first place.
Right. So in the beginning, how did you convince patients to convert to direct pay or, paying cash for a visit when they could easily see another physician, for less money or free?
Sure. Well, that's where having something that you can offer that sets you apart from everyone else. People loved coming to see us because our visit lengths were quite a bit more than your traditional practice. Part of that was because I was just opening up a new clinic and I didn't have the patient volume that warranted having to cram everyone into 15-minute spots. Right. But so that was one of our big advantages. Also, right out of residency, I started to pursue additional training in bioidentical hormone replacement, which gave me something that wasn't readily available in other areas. And that kind of transitioned into the functional medicine approach when we started managing conditions such as hypothyroidism, where we actually sat down with patients and paid more attention to their symptoms and how they were feeling as opposed to where their TSH fell on a range of normal. So that helped set us apart. And interesting, I can kind of share the story associated with this. Yeah. We got to the point that I was working 1 day a week, and then I would spend my other day a week doing all the insurance billing. So I basically couldn't see any more patients because I could only fit them into 1 day a week. So I told the patients that, if they wanted to come to our clinic, they were welcome to see my nurse practitioner, but she wasn't credentialed with insurance, and they would need to pay her directly. Well, what I saw is that my nurse practitioner started making 4 times the amount that I did because she wasn't having to spend half of her time begging insurance companies for half the amount of reimbursement. So I, basically, without having a choice in the matter, she started seeing patients, and I saw how well that did for her. So as soon as we opened our new clinic in Memphis, we didn't even attempt to get credentialed.
Okay, gotcha. And when you say we, it's you and a nurse?
Well, we started out with 3 providers. I had a nurse practitioner early on, which I'm not sure why I thought that would be a good idea, other than the fact that she was amazing, and together we really learned how to manage these complex hormone patients. So from that standpoint, I don't regret at all having that extra overhead that we didn't need at the time, because she's really done amazing and she stays booked out several months in advance. But the other thing that we did was, our official clinic name is WellFit Medicine and Nutrition. So we had my mom, who's a registered dietitian, working with us from the very beginning. Wow. And what we've done is we've integrated the nutrition part even more with our new model in Memphis. Patients will meet with her for an hour before they meet with me for an hour. So the initial intake process is roughly 3 hours spread out over 2 different visits. And It's amazing how much we're able to accomplish with those initial visits.
Yeah, I was going to say, you said it's 2 hours?
The initial visit's 2 hours, but what we do even prior to meeting with the patient, we have them come in. We have a registration process that helps organize and process their history, utilizing an automated check-in system, as well as a complex software that really does an amazing job of taking a patient history and representing it visually. So what it helps the patient do is put together a timeline that shows, starting even before birth up until their current age, the different things that have impacted their health, and then it plots them on what we call the patient matrix, which looks at different areas of dysfunction as we're trying to address the whole patient, including even some of the emotional and spiritual needs that impact health, but rarely do we have a chance to even address in your typical 5-minute visit.
Wow. So the first thing is you guys spend a tremendous amount more time than anyone I've heard of. The second thing that I heard was this software system. That sounds really amazing. What is this software?
It's called the Living Matrix, and it was developed in conjunction with the Institute for Functional Medicine as a way to help synthesize and process these, stacks of patient histories that patients often accumulate over the years, rather than sitting down with, a stack that would take hours to go through. The patient enters these in as they're prompted by the software, and we're able to access that information and visually review that with the patient. It's really a pretty powerful tool, because what it does is it helps the patient see the patterns in their life and make connections where these different areas of dysfunction started to affect their function and ultimately their health. And it's important that the patient understand what caused some of this dysfunction in the first place, so that they don't continue to do the same thing and expect that the results will somehow be different.
Wow, that's really powerful. And I like that the patient has to take care of the initial portion, and that eases the transition for you guys. It's kind of empowering the patient to take care of themselves initially.
Exactly. And I think ultimately that's what we want. If I was to summarize what I do, the most succinct definition I've been able to come up with is that I provide goal-oriented care for motivated patients. So if a patient doesn't have a goal, it's going to be hard for me to help them, because I can't care more about their health than they do. As much as I would want to, I can't, I can't prepare their meals. I can't be there with them exercising every day. So I can work with them and help them as much as they're going to let me help them, but I can't do it for them.
Exactly. Right. Another question that came up in my mind as I was listening was, you discussed overhead costs, and I've been receiving a couple of comments that, we're describing some of these clinics as micro practices or opening up your own practice. But how have you been able to cultivate a lower overhead cost, but still have a quality experience?
One thing that we did was we relied on some of these technologies to help us out. So we've got online scheduling. We only use our phones for scheduled phone visits. So if a patient has a question, we ask them to contact us through the patient portal or via email. As much as I would like to hire a receptionist, that would just make more work for me, because I would just end up with a stack of messages at the end of the day, and that would just add to the administrative tasks. So by having the patients contact us electronically, we're able to respond more quickly in between patient visits. That avoids the phone tag, and it also helps patients be a little bit more proactive in planning their appointment scheduling and things like that. They can do it all online, which if you look at my patient population, I tend to have a lot of busy professionals, in addition to that patient that I mentioned that had been to multiple different physicians. So I end up seeing a lot of most of my patients tend to be proactive, because I guess we just don't really make it easy. It's not a walk-in clinic. It's kind of a process to get involved, but they find that once they invest that initial time, that the care that they receive is, more than they've experienced previously.
Right. And so you spoke about this kind of software that you use. Is this something any physician could get their hands on, or was this specifically tailored towards your practice? Is it the same Living Matrix you had discussed before?
Well, we actually use a few different companies, and I have yet to find one that meets all the needs together. So we started out with two initially, Hello Health, which is an which is an EMR system that was actually, I think, developed out of Canada. So it was remarkably user-friendly. It almost had a Facebook feel to it. When you click on patients and, I'm able to e-prescribe and I can have all of my notes and we can upload all the labs. So it's a very functional EMR system. We also use a company called Frisia, which provides these iPads that are essentially available in the office. They have a card swipe on them, so if the patient has a balance, you don't even have to worry about trying to collect that. The pad will do that automatically, and it will also verify the insurance, which is helpful. Even though we're not able to run the visits through insurance, we do use insurance for processing the lab testing and things like that, because we have an extensive initial lab panel, which would be cost prohibitive if it were just a purely cash pay system.
And the reason I bring that up, and thank you for offering that information, is, for anyone who's trying to come up with these options of how to open up their own practice, they might even not have an awareness that these things exist. So thank you for offering that. So just to take a step back here, would you have considered yourself a happy medical student?
As a medical student, I was extremely happy. I definitely got off on the wrong foot during my first year. I was dating a girl at the time who was a year ahead of me, and she made med school look so easy. I think, I saw how easy it was for her, and I thought, wow, I think everyone's just overreacting. They don't need to study quite that much. I'm going to play it cool and see what happens. And of course, I failed miserably in the beginning and then had to work really hard to dig myself out. So once we got out of the first 2 years, those definitely weren't the funnest 2 years of my life, because I didn't want to study and take tests for the rest of my life. I wanted to work with patients. So once we got to the clinical years, I really felt like that's where I wanted to be. And did well on the rotations, and in contrast to from where I started first year and then where things ended, it was definitely a huge change. But I would describe overall my med school experience as being great. One of the things that I was able to do during med school that was pretty unique is I was able to start up a clinic in med school, which really helped lay the foundation for the clinic that I ended up starting out of residency. So I worked with a group to start a nonprofit clinic for Hispanic patients in the city. And since I spoke Spanish, we had medical Spanish classes. We taught the med students how to draw blood, how to process labs, how to work up the patient, and then ultimately we had volunteer attendings that we would present to, and they would give recommendations. So we would provide care, usually just 1 day a week at no cost to the patient. Wow.
And that kind of provided the building blocks for you to understand how to build your own clinic later, I'm sure.
It did, and I didn't appreciate that at the time, but looking back, that was an invaluable experience.
So what did you learn from that experience that helped you out as you moved forward? Like, what specific sort of information did you gain that maybe someone who hasn't done that would need to know?
Well, I think what was nice as a medical student, since you don't get paid, basically, if you're going to do anything, you're really only doing that based on where your interests and passions truly lie. Now, I guess one of the advantages I had is that once I realized that I wasn't cut out to be a general surgeon and decided on family medicine, I didn't have to, worry about, applying to hundreds of different programs across the country and just hoping that I would get a spot. So I was really able to spend most of my time as a student pursuing those areas that interest me most, and I guess that was pretty exciting. I'm kind of unique, and I don't recommend this for anybody who's listening, but I only applied to one med school and only applied to one residency program.
Wow.
Yeah. Not necessarily the smartest thing to do, but it worked out great. And I guess I've always been fairly decisive on knowing exactly what I want and then just going after it.
Right. So for you, your biggest part there was you figured out what you wanted to do and you just went for it. And I do think that many students are feeling kind of unsure of themselves and they're trying to figure out what they love. So I think that's a big message, is just figuring out what you love and then going for it.
I think so. And knowing, I guess once you start getting, you're able to separate some of the bureaucracy and the politics and the financial incentives and really just do what you love, which for me was helping people, making a meaningful, significant difference in their health and their quality of life. And, I get to do that every day now professionally, and it's pretty amazing.
So why were you so drawn to family medicine as opposed to another field?
Well, I couldn't find one that I liked more than the others. I really enjoyed all of them, so family became the obvious choice. And even to this day, I still find myself practicing more broadly than most people that I know. So I've got my outpatient clinic. I still deliver babies. I'll do office procedures. I've even done some cosmetic procedures. And I'll even see hospital patients when I'm on call on the weekends. So I get to do a little bit of everything, and that's probably what appealed to me the most.
Right. And you had described a little bit of specialization. Obviously, you've done the functional medicine, which is kind of a form of specialization. And then the hormonal course you took as well. So you've been able to kind of find some niches within family medicine, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that's important, and that's what's one of the advantages to choosing family medicine. So any students that are listening and not exactly sure what they want to do, it's kind of hard to go wrong with family medicine because you can kind of take that in any direction that you choose if you're unsure exactly where you want to be just coming out of school.
Right. And as opposed to directly specializing and then maybe thinking like, wait, what did I just get myself into?
Yeah, it's a lot. There's a lot more opportunities kind of going in that general primary care route as opposed to specializing. And then not that there aren't plenty of people that end up switching later on. I just don't know that it's as easy once you've invested that amount of time in specializing.
Mm-hmm. What qualifies as happiness to you?
Ooh, that is a good question. Wow, that could be a whole podcast interview topic in and of itself. I think for me, it's just being able to make a difference and feel like, at some point I'm able to offer something of value to another person that they, couldn't necessarily receive otherwise. So, something, when patients come and see us, they're pretty vulnerable. They're willing to, if they follow our recommendations, we could potentially, our first goal is to do no harm. So there's a lot of trust that they place in us. So, being able to really help somebody make a meaningful change in their life is my definition of professional happiness. Personally, I guess I'm still trying to figure that out. I ended up, spending a lot of time just focused on career. If I could start to spend as much time on my personal life, that would be a good thing. That's probably part of the reason why I work so much, so that I don't have to answer those hard questions. So I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Well, this isn't a therapy session, so we won't dig too much further into that.
All right, thanks.
Let me break into this a little bit. Did you feel like there was a time where you experienced a great challenge or a breaking point or a conflict on the road that really changed the way you thought about things in terms of medicine?
Yes. Well, from a difficulty standpoint, I mentioned getting started on the wrong foot in my first year of med school. I think the next challenge I had was my intern year. And I think that really just had to do with the volume of work and the duty hours and probably some personal health challenges that I really wasn't fully aware of at the time. But I would definitely say the intern year was a challenge.
And what should a student such as myself, I mean, I'm a fourth year, what should someone expect going into intern year and ways of like protecting themselves going into that situation and how to just mentally prepare for that?
Sure. So one of the things that they've done is they've changed the duty hours. I just remember some of those calls that would go well beyond 24 hours, and that was just grueling. Having somebody work more than 24 hours is just not very humane. We wouldn't want truck drivers or pilots to do that. I don't know why the person who's delivering our baby or making decisions regarding our health should be any better qualified to put in those kind of hours and expect to have a positive result.
Right. And obviously sleep deprivation is kind of like being intoxicated in a way. So, yep.
Yeah, it is. And I think you brought this up in your Kevin MD article, and it definitely resonated with me. And in some ways, I was a little surprised at how bold you were in, calling out physicians in general. But you were right on in that we've got to prioritize our own health. Why is there this disconnect between what we ask our patients to do and what we're willing to do ourselves? So we, don't get enough sleep, eat crappy hospital food, don't exercise, and then just wonder why, we're worse off than some of our patients. So I think going into things, maintaining that sense of identity, who you are, what you enjoy, maintaining some of those connections with friends and family, pastimes, hobbies, exercise, you've got to try to be a whole person and not just dedicate everything into medicine, because medicine will, suck as much out of you as you're willing to give.
Yeah. And thank you, first off, for acknowledging the article. For me, it was kind of just logical. Like, I think about it as we're human beings. We require certain needs. And if those needs aren't met, we can't do a good job with others. And I more and more see that, each year I'm getting more part of this culture. We, as a group, have started to justify losing our human rights, so to speak. And it's propagated in the system because people are justifying why they did that themselves. So, like, things like this are ways for us to start up that conversation and say, look, you don't deserve to be unhappy. You deserve to be happy to help other people. So thank you. I appreciate that. Going into the next question, looking back 10 years, what would you tell a younger Jeremy?
Wow. I would look back 10 years or even, I think back to that intern year, as much as and I don't know why there's a stigma with with admitting it, but, I'll come out and say that I was, passively suicidal at the time. That was a dark time. And I think what I would have told myself is that, wow, your life is ultimately going to be more amazing than you ever thought. Your level of professional satisfaction, the interaction that you're going to have with your patients, it's all going to be worth it, even more so than you ever thought possible. Hang in there, don't give up, because imagine your ultimate level of satisfaction and then multiply that by several times, and that's what your reality is going to become. So I think sometimes we end up limiting ourselves by our vision of what we think is possible. And for me, it's always been helpful to have somebody tell me that I couldn't do something. So, somebody to tell me, hey, you've got to apply to more than one med school because you're probably not going to get in. You better not just apply to one residency. Why open your own clinic? What do you know about business? So, I like having that challenge challenge, and not just to prove people wrong, but I like to be able to prove to myself, hey, you know what, I can do hard things. Med school is a hard thing, but it's a series of difficult things that you enter into on this journey, because when you're willing to do things that other people aren't willing to do, then you get to enjoy things that other people don't get to enjoy because they haven't put in that effort.
Right. So just to extrapolate a little bit, you're saying that you wouldn't have listened to this podcast because earlier on it would have given you permission to pursue your goals, but you would have wanted to be told no.
Well, I would have listened to this podcast, but I guess there would have been an area of disbelief, as much as I would have wanted to hope that, there was this, professional happiness and personal satisfaction and balance with, having your health and exercising and, having that connection between what you're asking your patient to do and what you're actually doing with your life. I don't know that I would have thought that it really would have been that possible. I didn't have, in some ways I'm a little envious. I didn't have the vision that, you have as a fourth year med student. So, if I could have had more of that, I think it would have been great, but I certainly don't have any regrets at this point.
Well, first off, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Secondly, I want listeners to hear what Jeremy just said, because he's saying it straight out that he did not think it was possible. And now all of a sudden he's at this point where he is happy. He's a practicing physician. He has his own methods of practicing. He's practicing with integrity and with congruency with his values. And it is possible. You just need to realize what your values are and what your vision is in order to create it. And that is, I want people to go back to those comments you made, because you are the example of someone who didn't think it was possible and then created it.
Yeah. And I think there's part of it too. There's a certain amount of sacrifice that it takes to get there. I think oftentimes once we get through med school or residency, we want the car, we want the house, we want the big paycheck, we want the trips and things like that. I put some of that off because, I knew that financially I didn't want to be beholden to the practice or the hospital or whoever it was that was providing that check. Each day I have to, basically earn a living by doing a good job and seeing patients and delivering results. And then they tell their friends who come in and see me, and I'm able to do it again the next day. So in some ways you have to be, willing to pay that price. But, I realized early on that, money was great, but it wasn't, it didn't do all that much for me. I should have been, I had my biggest paycheck ever, right out of residency. And, I was probably at my most miserable. So money didn't equal happiness. And I'm glad I learned that lesson right away.
Right. And I think that concept of delayed gratification is something, everyone's working on. It's easy to, I'm just going to go with food. It's easy to grab ice cream. It's hard to eat a bowl of vegetables, but, you also know that bowl of vegetables is nourishing for you. So we, as a whole, could definitely use that lesson. What would be your message to someone who's considering joining the medical field, but is kind of disheartened or feels hopeless given kind of the climate and what they're hearing?
Sure. Well, I equate being a physician to a calling. I knew from the time I was a little kid that I wanted to be a doctor. I think that anybody going into medicine other than wanting to make a contribution in the life of your future patients, there's really not room for a lot of other motivations. Now, certainly there's the intellectual part. I understand that there's a variety of motivations that go into it, but, if you're just wanting to find something that's interesting that, is good to make money, there's a lot of other ways that you can meet that. There's a lot of sacrifice that it takes to get to this point. And I would, make sure that anybody considering medicine, look at some of the other options out there. There's, you can be a nurse practitioner, a physician's assistant, or a chiropractor, or a physical therapist. There are a lot of rewarding ways that you can help people that don't necessarily require going through med school and residency. So I guess just make sure you know why it is that you're doing what you're doing, so that way when you get to those difficult moments, you can look back and realize, hey, I'm not a victim here. I signed up for this and I knew what I was getting into.
Right. So really taking it seriously and feeling that calling. And I heard from a different interview, we had spoken about being naturally just gravitating towards the field, reading articles and going out of your way to look up health topics on your own. So these are great tips for students kind of going into the field and who are interested. What was the best advice you received from a mentor?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know that I can pinpoint any one thing. I think ultimately we become kind of a collage of our different mentors over time.
Right.
And, we pick and choose different things that other physicians emulate. And, I guess I can't, recall one thing. I will share, though, one of my words of advice that I often give, and it's pretty simple, and that's don't settle. So, if you're not happy, you don't really have anyone to blame but yourself. Once you get to a certain point in your career, you can blame it on the program or the med school or whatever. But when you're out on your own, it's ultimately up to you. So I think that's pretty empowering, or at least it can be if you're willing to take ownership.
Right. And, it's easy to blame other people or the system, but, at the end of the day, we are an individual, and it's, as I stated in my article, it's our need and right to grab happiness with our hands and not someone else's, or not to put the blame on someone else. So that's a great message.
And life has its way of putting you in situations for learning. I remember when I was a medical student, I was seeing a patient, and she was an older patient who, was had some type of cancer, and I think it had recurred. And, I was in there seeing her, and, I remember she was kind of turning the table on me. She wanted to know how I was doing, how I was feeling. She wanted to know about my background, and she made me feel so good as a person. I thought, wait a second, I'm supposed to be here helping you, and you're helping me. And when you're willing to open up to that, I have great interactions with my patients, and I gain a lot from them, and I hope that they gain a lot from me. I guess if they didn't, they wouldn't keep coming back. But I think realizing that, that's part of the reason why we're here, to have these human experiences, and that's okay. Sometimes they're difficult, sometimes they're emotional, sometimes they're not easy. But when you look back, those are the ones that are going to really stand out to you.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. And there's definitely great patient interactions even as a student, and it's just great to see that, you're continuing to have those. So,
well, what, and if you look at it, what's one of the things that you have as a student that you don't have when you're in residency or sometimes out in practice? You actually have time to sit there and go through that somewhat clumsy, awkward, hour-long student history and physical, but that's where you really learn the most.
Absolutely. And that gets extremely truncated outside of medical school. So, and that's one of the things I felt like I was missing and I've been missing lately is that time just to be with someone and be human with human and get to know them.
Yeah. Well, at this point, for whatever it's worth, I don't worry about your future success as a physician because you get it. So, I don't see you settling. And, if I find out a couple of years from now that you've, fallen off track, I'll remind you of this podcast interview and, make sure you get back on track. But, you get it. I think we're all in the process of getting it. One thing that I've learned here recently from some pretty impressive mentors is that you never arrive. You reach a certain level of success, and then you kind of push the limits a little bit, not because you have to, but because you can. And you realize that life's too short to not really go after it completely and passionately.
Wow, that was great. I'm going to have to quote that definitely within the article at some point. And thank you for offering to keep me in line later in the future. You have any favorite books, authors, bloggers, materials that you follow that inspire you and you feel like would be a kind of good offering for anyone listening?
I do. There is a book that, and I've got to send a shout out to Dallas and Melissa Hartwig, the authors of It Starts With Food. I think that was one of the best nutrition books that I ever read at any point in my medical career, and I still refer patients to it because it really helps correct a lot of the dysfunctional relationship that we have with food. And if we would just eat real healthy food, we would be so much healthier. We tend to make it awfully more complex than it needs to be. But I think that is, definitely a huge one for me. I'm also a fan of Dr. Amy Myers, who kind of got me into functional medicine. She has a new book out, The Thyroid Connection, and her first book, The Autoimmune Solution. I think both of those are pretty helpful as well.
Wow. Well, I will personally take a look into it, and if anyone's interested, I hope you guys look into those materials as well. Thank you for offering that. How would you improve the current medical culture? I know it's a very broad question.
No, I can answer that one quickly. The biggest problem I see right now is that medical students and residents are trying to practice what I would call checklist medicine. There are so many guidelines and there are so many insurance requirements that by the time you go through checking all the boxes, you've exceeded the time that you had with the patient. And oftentimes, you're not even addressing what the patient came there for in the first place. So we've gotten away from that ability to think and to come up with a good assessment and plan. And so much of what we end up spending most of our time doing could be automated, and actually we have automated it with our little check-in pads. They go through and ask all these questions so that we can just focus on what it is that the patient came in for in the first place. So we've got to do that. I work with some amazing residents, but I see that their ability to think critically and really think through a detailed plan for a patient is not what it could be.
Wow. That's a great answer, and it's very sad that that's the case currently. So hopefully we can change that culture. So thank you for that answer. Is there anything you wish medical students, residents, attending physicians knew about your life?
About my life? I think my life is pretty much an open book, which is nice. I'm not, I've, never not been willing to share my opinion. And it's nice to see that evolve over time. So, I try not to be too inflexible or too opinionated because I realize that that's subject to change, where I'm at in my particular journey. I think the other thing that I would include at this point too is to not, that med students and residents, even physicians out there practicing, need to be afraid or not be afraid to be vulnerable. Not don't be afraid to open yourself up to the patient, to really connect with them, because ultimately that's what is going to make not only a big difference for them, but also a big difference for you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Great answer. What would be your ideal medical school?
I think my ideal medical school, I think I would like to keep the last 2 years clinical like they are, but what I would do the first 2 years, if it were up to me, is I would have a lot more case-based learning. I think there's some necessary evils when it comes to anatomy and physiology and some of the, the core classes. I would still have those, but I would try to include more practical hands-on education. For example, with pharmacology, instead of having people spend all this time regurgitating drugs that they'll never use, I would try to focus on the 100 most prescribed drugs and really hit those hard.
Sure. That sounds much more applicable than my experience with pharmacology. And what would be your, actually, just to go back with the case-based medicine, I agree, because being closer to it, I felt like a lot of the times I was learning information, but I couldn't apply it. And having that more case-based experience would have, especially early on, would have made things more tangible for me. So definitely agree with that. What would be, as a continuation, your ideal residency?
I think the ideal residency would probably try to have a little less volume. I know that there's a certain number of required cases and visits and interactions and things like that, but I think sometimes we do that at the expense of learning. I think most people want to do a good job and could do a really good job if they just had a little bit more time in which to do it. I remember one of the most ridiculous things I ever read was written by a consultant who was giving advice on how to navigate some of the changes with the Affordable Care Act. And it said that, all physicians need to do is increase their productivity, and instead of seeing 6 patients an hour, they should plan on seeing 10. And I thought that was the worst advice I ever saw, because not only is it hard enough to see 6 patients in an hour, who on earth would want to see 10 patients in an hour?
Yeah. That sounds impossible.
Well, coming from a non-physician, and that's a problem. Physicians have delegated a lot of the, actual practice of medicine to hospital administrators and insurance companies, because we wanted to focus on seeing the patients, and, now it's coming back to bite us. So that probably wasn't a good move.
Right, because they don't have the perspective. That makes a lot of sense. With that being said, I don't have many questions left. The last thing I just wanted to add is there any additional information you wanted to share to the listeners that you think is an important message and for the community at large?
Yeah, one thing we haven't really talked about too much is the fitness component, and that was kind of an interesting thing for me. I guess I spent most of my life studying and focusing on school, didn't really do much from a physical standpoint. That really changed for me in med school when I started skiing and snowboarding, and that was something that was completely new to me, and I loved it, and it was a lot of fun. But as you can imagine, living in Memphis, Tennessee, there really aren't many opportunities for skiing and snowboarding close by. So what I was trying to do was find out a way to keep up my fitness the rest of the year, so that when I did have those 1 or 2 weeks a year, I could really hit the slopes hard and, not be sucking wind most of the time.
Sure.
So I got a trainer to help me out while I was in med school, and actually in residency, and that was kind of fun. And then I came across CrossFit, and that was kind of cool because it gave me a way to challenged myself physically outside of skiing and snowboarding, and
Right.
it ended up being something that I enjoyed so much that I got certified as a CrossFit coach.
Wow.
And that was really a crucial turning point in my medical career, because that coincided with the time that I got out of residency. So I had this parallel view of health where I was coaching patients, seeing them get healthier, lose weight, reach their fitness goals, while I spent all day handing out prescriptions that really didn't seem to do much good.
Right.
So for me, one of the critical turning points was when I had this idea of combining a clinic and a CrossFit gym under the same roof. So
Wow.
the front part of our clinic is where we have our office space, and then in the back we have our gym. So being able to incorporate those two, and we actually do that from the first visit. Patients come in, they walk in through the gym and wonder, wait a second, am I in the right place? I've never seen a clinic like this before. And that's probably one of the biggest compliments I could get. Oh, wait a second, this isn't like anything I've ever seen before. And that's all very deliberate and intentional, because when you walk into a CrossFit gym, it's probably similar to some of the gymnastics gyms that you worked out at before.
Sure.
You got rings and bars and weights, but not a bunch of, fancy elliptical machines and treadmills with TV screens. So when you walk in and you see that environment, wow, that's going to require some work and some effort. But you know what? That's okay. I don't know why we, are thinking that that's a bad thing in some ways.
Absolutely. And that sounds like something I would want to create personally, as a former athlete. And it's great that you combined these things you love into one clinic. And that's something special that you can only do when you create your own thing. And that's probably why you also get a lot of satisfaction from it, because you are developing your own style of practicing, so to speak.
Well, I think that's one of the few areas where you can actually be creative. In medicine, you don't really get to do that. You don't just sit and ponder, ooh, which, exciting drug can I use today? Everything's very cut and dry in some ways, and protocol driven, and then you've got these general recommendations and standards of care and things like that, and then insurance formularies which ultimately dictate what you can and cannot do. So being able to actually be creative in medicine is something that we don't get to really talk about too much.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a bigger conversation I constantly want to be pushing, because I think that's something we're lacking. And the reason we're not enjoying medicine as it used to be, it's feeling less and less of an art and more just this kind of standard of care way of treatment, which obviously it's there for a reason, but we can also incorporate more of that art and creativity into what we do.
Yeah, and it's important. And I think first and foremost, residents and medical students need to firmly grasp what that standard of care is. So that way, when you decide to deviate from it, you know exactly why you're doing that. So, that's important. At this point, I've gotten my board certification and jumped through all the hoops, and now I can do things on my own terms, and I'll explain exactly why we're going to do that when I discuss with the patient, hey, I don't think we need to give you all these drugs. I think we need to take this approach, and here's why.
Right, and then obviously you're getting the consent of them to work on the plan, so there's no animosity or anything like that. So that's awesome. And with that being said, was there anything else you wanted to add?
Just to piggyback on that last point that you made, I think, medicine was criticized initially from being kind of this patriarchal, I'm the physician, I know what's best, here's what you need to do. And then we, had informed consent and involving the patients in their care. And I think sometimes that's actually led us to shy away from giving a recommendation. Instead, we often put the patient in this awkward position, okay, you tell me what you want me to do for you. And that's not fair to them either, because, they didn't go to medical school and they're not paying us to, just throw out a bunch of options without giving a recommendation. So I think it's important to give a recommendation, but then to let the patient know, hey, I can give you my best advice, but ultimately you're going to have to decide what you're willing to do. So here are the options. This is what I would do if I were in your shoes, but what are you willing to do, and how can we, come up with a compromise if necessary?
Right. So, yeah, and I completely agree, because one end is being too authoritative. The other end is you're not providing your professional opinion and expert opinion. So, yeah, that's a really great point for someone like me to hear, to not necessarily give in to just their wants and needs.
Yeah, exactly. You want to enable, you want to empower and educate patients. You don't want to enable. Ultimately, when your patients are able to do well without you, they've kind of moved on to that next level, and that's a great thing. You don't, when I hear somebody who's been, seeing a certain physician for, so many different years, and I still, see that there are some things that aren't well controlled, I just kind of wonder how effective that relationship actually is if, there really aren't any changes being made or results being seen.
Right. And I can definitely comment on that, saying I've seen times where there's the same person coming in and having no change, and they consistently come in. So yeah, there's definitely a need for an alternative approach, or maybe a little bit more of a push in that situation. So, well, with that being said, thank you so much, Jeremy, Dr. Draper. I sincerely appreciate you being on this show. You've provided a lot of great insight, and speaking about your fitness and functional medicine practice is another flavor on this podcast that we haven't had. So sincerely appreciate having you here.
Okay, perfect. And, any students or listeners that have any questions, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to get back with you. Anybody in the area that wants to come by and check out our practice, I'm certainly proud of it and love to show it off. So anything I can do to help you out on your journey, just let me know.
And there you have it, folks. That's the end of the episode for today. If you want to check out any more material, go to www.thehappydoc.com. Also, if you'd like to provide feedback, ask any questions, please comment on the blog posts or send an email to thehappydoc1@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening in, and I hope you have a great week. Take care.